work or previous webinars. We're going to look at those for Australian summer and winter. And we're looking at two different climate change scenarios. One is where we stabilize warming at around 2.7 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century. And one is for where we just go beyond that to 4 degrees and above by the end of the century. And we're looking at two periods. We're looking at mid-century, 2045 to 2055, and end of century, so 2090 to 2100. And I'll be showing you how my research shows these indices changing over the course of the century. So here we've got the heat load index, which you'll know already. And we're showing the historical baseline and the contour there. What we're looking at is the number of days that HLI exceeds 86, which is the accumulation threshold for Angus steers. And I'm also looking at the 96 threshold. That work is coming along for Brahman steers. So yeah, as you'll know from Kieran, John, Angela, and Tim's talks, anything above that HLI threshold of 86 can really start to affect livestock feed intake, weight gain, and overall health. So that contour there shows in the current period, in this historical baseline, how many days are, where there are 50 days or more above that threshold in December on the left, summer on the left and winter on the right. So looking next at the mid-century scenario in the low warming, that dashed contour now shows where the historical baseline was, and the black contour on this one shows where we've got more than 50 days above that HLI threshold in the current period. So you can see that with warming, we are starting to get that, more days above 86 heat load index and further south. And then by the end of the century, that increases even further. But then if we look at the high warming scenario, that is actually in the mid-century looking quite similar to what the low warming was, or lower warming in end of century. So yeah, with high warming, we really get this accelerated response of the HLI. So that's in the mid-century and high warming scenario. And then by end of century, you can see that we've, just far, far exceeded that, that historical baseline of days above 50, days above 86. And the current contour there is much further south. Now, this one is a human thermal stress threshold. So this is, what we're looking at is basically an effort meter. It's a unit of effort which stands, MET stands for metabolic equivalent of task. So just sitting still is about 1.5 MET. That's the sort of exertion you're under. Doing light housework might be 3 MET. more intense activities like dancing could be 5 METs, and that's shown on that scale on the right. I've done a few calculations to estimate that cattle mustering is about 2.3 to 6.1 METs, depending on whether you're male or female, whether you're on foot or on horseback. On any given day, based on the heat and humidity, there's a limit to how much effort you can safely handle before your own body starts to dangerously overheat. And this is called your M-max, or your maximum safe activity level. So on a cool, comfortable day, your M-max is very high, you go for a run, and your body can easily cool itself down. But on a very hot and humid day, your body struggles to get rid of heat, just like your livestock do. And as a result, your M-max, your safe activity level, really drops dramatically. So you might only be able to do a slow walk or something that's safe, and anything more strenuous would cause your body to overheat. So yeah, here we're looking at the historical MET, and that contour there is where your safe metabolical equivalent is 4. So if anything, if the value is under 4, I've taken that as about a mean of what I think cattle mustering would be. If it's under 4, it's unsafe to perform that activity. So then we look at the lower warming scenario in the mid-century. You can see there's still not very much risk of being under your safe metabolical equivalent in winter, but in summer we're getting that spread down south. Not too much change when it comes to the end of century, but still more there. And then if we go to the mid-century and higher warming, again, you'll see it's fairly similar to what we had in the end of century for lower warming. And then finally up to end of century in a higher warming scenario, we're really seeing that, almost all of Australia is going to have a lot of days where it is unsafe to reach that level 4 of metabolical equivalent during summer, and quite a few days there up in the north in winter as well. So I think that pretty much covers me. Yep. So I will hand back to Vicky for now.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That's actually fascinating, looking sort of what those working conditions can possibly look like for us. So we can only just imagine what it's going to look like for our livestock as well as we go forward. That's really interesting. And thank you for your work that you're doing on this, Rachel. I'm going to throw over now to Dr. Tim Cowan, and Tim's going to talk us through My Climate View. It's a longer-term prediction tool that you can use that's been developed, and then he'll also have a look at the latest seasonal outlook there before we have our Q&A session. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Vicky, and good morning, everyone. So as you might recall from our first webinar, we were really focusing on the weekly scale forecast, so the day-to-day changes in livestock thermal stress, and that was through the NACP website and the thermal stress forecast that we've got there. But today I'm just going to briefly show you what you can do using the My Climate View information on the portal. And so, as it says here, it provides Australian farmers, producers, with a tailored insight into how their climate will change and how that might affect their commodity. So, to access this website, it's simply myclimateview, it's one word, .com.au, and it'll take you to this page here. And so the first thing you have to do is put in the location that you're interested in. So I'm going to put in Longreach. So you can follow on your own computer if you want, or you can, at a later time, you can go and look at your own region. So you put in Longreach, and you can pretty much choose any location across Australia. And then it comes to this option here to choose your commodity. So there's a few to choose from, and I think what it usually does is it tries to link a particular region with a particular commodity. So typically you'll be looking at beef cattle in this region, so we can select that as our commodity, and then we just click on View Information. And this takes us to this page where it gives you a nice sort of overview of some of the climate changes that you would expect by the mid-century and by the end of the century, that relate to beef cattle for your region. So a nice summary of changes in wet season rainfall, dry season rainfall, cold days limiting pasture growth, heat stress, and heat waves. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the heat stress days, because essentially that's what we've been learning about over the past few webinars. So it gives you a nice summary of the changes in heat stress days in the historical periods of what's been observed. And then it also gives you a summary of what the change will likely be by the mid-century. And that's based on these climate models that Rachel has been looking at in her work. And then you can also look at the change in your metric that will affect your commodity. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore this in more detail. So we just click on that, takes you to another page. Now this page will detail all the information you need to know about that particular meteorological metric. So in this case, it's heat stress days. And this tells you, first it gives you a definition of what heat stress is. And so what they do for this MyClimateView portal, they use the temperature humidity index, or THI, to define heat stress in cattle. So obviously we've been talking about heat load and accumulated heat load over the past few webinars. They don't have that as an option for MyClimateView, unfortunately, but this is the next best thing. So the first thing you can do is you can modify your definition. Just say you run a particular breed of cattle that are maybe more heat tolerant, and you understand that quite well, then you may want to modify your definition to say, well, I'm interested in knowing when I'll reach an emergency level of the THI, as opposed to, say, the alert level or danger level. So you can modify your definition. So I'm going to modify mine to say danger. So that's anything where a THI is greater than 79. And then you can also look at the time frame that you're interested in. So if you're, say, interested in the spring season or the warmer months, so the wet season, then you can change that here. So I'm going to put in September through to, say, November. And I'll just do 1st of September through the last day of November, and I'll save that. Gives you a nice little spiel here about what heat stress does to animals. That's good to know. And then what you go to is, as you scroll down the page, this gives you more information about the past conditions of heat stress for your region. And then it also gives you the likely future change. And as Rachel described in her talk, there are different emission scenarios that these projections are based off. So you can choose whether you want to look at a medium emission scenario. So that's where the warming by the end of the century may be slightly less than, say, 2 degrees or just over 2 degrees, or you can choose a high emission scenario. And there's more information if you hover over the information button here. It tells you about more of these emission scenarios, and you can click on if you want to do further reading and understand how they come up with these emission scenarios. You can do that. So I'm going to choose a high emission scenario. And that's where we increase greenhouse gases continually to the end of the century. And so overall global warming will be quite high. And if you go down the page now, it nicely plots out changes in the frequency of these heat stress events into the future. So there's lots of information on this, and I suggest if you want to have a bit of a play around, that's probably the best thing as opposed to me going through the whole thing. But essentially what it is, it's made up of past changes in previous decades. So here is the number of days that are above that danger threshold, the THI, from 1965 to 1994. And each of these dots represents a single September, October, November season. And then the straight line is just the average. So it's saying that at Longreach, the number of days that were above the danger level for spring was 47. And then if you go into the next series of dots here, again, this is still historical observed information. It's showing you now that there's been an increase in the past sort of 25 years or so, or 30 years. And then as you move into these brown colors, that's where you start getting climate projection information based on the high emission scenario. And so you can see, I mean, you can just look at the gradual increase in the number of days that are above the danger level. And if you look out to the end of the century, you can see now, based on climate model projections, that there's been a big increase in the number of days above that danger level. So you've gone from, say, 47 days in the 1970s and 1980s through to above 72 days on average by the end of the century. So that's pretty much that in a nutshell. Have a play around. You can change the scenario, and you can see if we track a sort of gentler emission scenario, so one where the warming is not so severe by the end of the century, then you can see that the increase in the heat stress days is not as significant. Okay, so that's my climate view. As I said, have a bit of a play around. There's lots of information here. If you want to know information about the models that are used, you can get that information from the data access and the data sources. And if you want other commodities or other metrics, you can do the same sort of thing. Go back and choose rainfall or choose heat wave events and so on. So good to play around in your own time. All right, so I'll just move on to what's in store for this current season in terms of temperatures, which will likely affect heat load and accumulated heat load. So going to the Bureau webpage, so I'm already on the Bureau webpage, but hopefully you all know by now it's bom.gov.au. And if you go to the climate and past weather option down sort of towards the bottom there, click on that, and this takes you to the long range weather and climate page. There are a couple of ways to get to the seasonal prediction page. One is clicking on the long range forecast option on the right hand side. The other way is to go to the left hand tabs and click on long range forecasts. Before I do that, I just want to make a quick note that the Bureau is changing their webpage or their front end webpage in October, and it will look more like this. So opposed to this setup, it'll look like this. So to find those long range climate pages, you just have to go up the top here to weather and climate, go across to long range weather, click on that. It's a little bit hard, but then it'll take you to this page, and then you just click on the long range weather and climate tab there, and it'll take you to the same page as this. So that won't change at all. So it's just a different way of getting to the same information. So let's click on the long range forecasts. So it automatically takes you to this page where you have an option to choose either the rainfall or the temperature. I'm going to focus on the temperature today because that's been obviously the subject of what we've been discussing over the past few weeks. And then you can get a summary or specific information on changes in maximum or minimum temperature in the next sort of 3 to 4 months. So let's click on a maximum temperature. So the first thing you see the first option you have is to look at the chance of above median temperatures for the next week, 2 weeks, 1 month, or 3 months. But what I'm going to show you is something probably a little bit more important with respect to heat stress, and that is the chance of extremes. So click on the chance of extremes there. This takes you to 2 options. One is, what is the chance of having unusually cold conditions in the next week, 2 weeks, month, 3 months, or unusually warm. So given we've been talking about heat load, I'm going to click on unusually warm there. And I'm going to be focusing on the next sort of 3 months, so September, October, November. So up the top here, I'm clicking on the 3-month outlook. So now this shows you a map of what the chances are of being unusually warm in terms of maximum temperatures for the next 3 months, so September through November. So you can see there's lots of red there, particularly across Northern Australia. And what this is quite significant, and the colour legend across the right-hand side there tells you the percentage chance and also the number of times more likely those unusual temperatures will be. So anything where it's really dark red, that's saying that there's 2.5 to 3 or even 3.5 times the normal likelihood of unusually warm conditions for spring. So that means there's a pretty strong likelihood that it's going to be in the top 20% of warmest springs in terms of maximum temperatures. Clicking on minimum temperature now, same sort of thing. You've got chance of above median and also the chance of extremes. I'm just going to click on the chance of being unusually warm, go across to 3 months. And now this is what the map looks like. And you can see there's lots of dark red, particularly across northern Queensland and the Northern Territory. And what's that saying is that there is a 4 times likelihood that minimum temperatures in the coming spring will be in the top 20% of warmest minimum temperatures. And one of the last things I'll do is you can get specific information for your region of interest as well. So again, you can click on the map there if you approximately know where your region is, or you can do a search using the search tab here. And I'm just going to choose long reach again. And choose long reach, and it takes a little bit of time to come up. It's okay. And what this will tell you is it'll give you specific information about the types of the range of temperatures that you would expect and that you would likely exceed in the upcoming season. So the first graph that comes up is it's a breakdown of each of what we call deciles. So decile 1 and 2, which are the colder 20% of temperatures, all the way up to decile 9 and 10, which are those warmest 20%. And these grey bars indicate the percentage of model experiments or model simulations. And in the case of the Bureau, we have 99 model or close to 100 model simulations per day. That's saying 75% of those model simulations are suggesting that the temperatures will be in that top 20%. So these are minimum temperatures, and this is for spring. And then this gives you more information about what sort of temperatures you may expect. So here we have 75% of those model runs are suggesting that it's going to be unusually warm in spring for long reach, and that unusually warm for long reach is above 18.2 degrees. Okay, one of the last things I'll just talk about is that if you want to understand the accuracy of your forecast, so often that's one of the things we hear about when we're giving talks is that how do we know that the forecasts are good for this time of year? You can click on past accuracy, and that takes you to these green maps here. And if you click on unusually warm again, this tells you now for September to November how accurate in the past the model was at getting the temperature correct or being in the right decile in the forecast. So anything, the darker the greener it is, the more accurate that model was in the past. And finally, just while I've got you here, if we go back to the climate page, to try and understand why are we getting these types of forecasts for warmer conditions or warmer nighttime conditions, you can get information on the climate drivers which may be coming into play in the springtime. So if we go on to the Southern Hemisphere monitoring, and this will take you to a page where it gives you a nice summary of what climate drivers are likely going to be in play for the coming months and seasons. And one of the things we do notice is that the Bureau has been noticing in terms of the monitoring side is that the Indian Ocean dipole looks like it's entering into its negative phase. And when that happens, that increases the likelihood of wetter springs, particularly across the east coast or the eastern half of Australia, and also increases the likelihood of warmer nighttime temperatures, which usually go hand in hand with wetter conditions. Okay, I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Vicky, for the Q&A.
Thank you so much there, Tim. Now let's hope I can get this right and move us all over to the right type of viewing. So I'll get all our expert panelists to just show their beautiful faces. And yeah, Tim, that's a really good segue now into our Q&A session that we're about to conduct. We've received some terrific questions throughout the series, and one of the first questions that we will address, just given that we've looked at that latest seasonal outlook, is we keep getting these similar question: are there specific management practices that help during extreme weather events like heat waves, cold windy conditions, or stormy periods that we can implement to assist with that thermal regulation in our livestock and keep that productivity going forward? Might throw to you there first, John, on that one.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. Kieran can probably help with this as well, and Ange, but I guess shelter is the main tool that we have in many cases, and particularly around young stock, and particularly around weaners. So making sure that if we have cold conditions, wet conditions, that those animals have some way of seeking shelter out of the wind, out of the rain, if at all possible. I mean, it is limited to some extent around what we can do. Shade is a big driver under hot conditions, whether it's natural shade or artificial. And Kieran's been doing some work in that space. But I think that the key things are really having adequate shelter for the animals that you're involved with. Looking at the timing around some of the activities that we do in terms of moving livestock, if we can change those, particularly on those really hot days, it becomes quite important. Nutrition plays a role in there as well. So there's some things that can be done on a day-to-day basis, but a lot of it is much longer-term planning to try to get things in place that we can actually utilise to reduce some of that environmental stress, whether it's heat or cold. And I'll pass over to Kieran. He might want to add some stuff into that.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think there's also other things that are associated with heat load that come into play sometimes and are important to consider. So whilst we don't always, what we do know is that there's a change in animal behaviour, but quantifying the actual production impact of these things is a bit more difficult, and that's where the research is sitting at the moment. But what we know is when it gets hot, cattle congregate around water points. And if you've got, so simple things like making sure that the access points to those troughs is, dirt's well up until the edge, so that calves can get a drink as well, is another one. Also, in the past, we've found that when cattle congregate around these water points, big mobs, some of the calves or some of the production losses are actually from trampling of calves around those water points, and things like that. So even though we're talking about heat, there are other production impacts just in relation to just general animal behavior, not necessarily, that are correlated to the heat, but not directly a consequence of the heat themselves, if you know.
Kieran, would you add to that around the positioning of water troughs to like shady trees and stuff like that? So for on those hot days that movement to water can be facilitated by a shade resource?
What we find is that when cattle have plenty of shade, the time they spend near water is relatively constant. So when they are limiting shade, they're spending more time at the water points because that's their cooling mechanism. And so the risk would be reduced. But simple things like making sure your supply line for the trough is deep enough so that the water supplied to that trough is cool too is another practical outcome. But yeah, I agree. I think if you are one of the things that we have learned is putting shade directly over a trough is not a great thing to do because you get congregation. You're actually promoting congregation at that water point. Yeah.
I think that water quality and that water point is a very good strategy that we can easily can look at. I know one of the things, John, that I had learnt from you was that when we did go to a property visit out in Blackall, we'd noticed the having a sufficient spacing for all our animals there, because those dominant animals are standing over and getting that evaporative cooling, and it's something we sort of tend to overlook, isn't it? That is actually then having that sufficient enough spacing and allowing those animals to be able to come in, those less dominant animals.
Yeah, that's right, Vicky. It's and again, that's a hard one, because if you try to maximize water space based on the hottest days, you're going to have a lot of water space, and that sort of becomes a little bit impractical, but to an extent. But yes, I mean, I think definitely in the intensive areas around feedlots, for example, we know we're well under what the water space should actually be, but it then starts to impact on, for those. I guess the cost of the infrastructure going in for the days that it's hot, whether it's worthwhile or not, it's a hard one. But we could easily double water space, particularly in feedlots, and it's one of the strategies that people do use. They put in extra watering points on hot day if they know hot weather's coming in feedlots to get that out there. And as Kieran said before, that behaviour thing, if they're all bunching together, they're stopping airflow, they're getting heat from one another anyway, and we want those animals to actually spread out. So more watering points is beneficial in the long run for a number of reasons, not just heat.
Yeah, definitely. And you talked there about that shade. It actually leads perfectly into that. Just how much, one of the questions that we've had come through, and that's been quite consistent, well, just how much shade or shelter is needed for livestock in different environments. Yards versus rangelands versus those more intensive systems. If we just look at just those, like just our cull yards and more of our paddock scenarios instead of the intensive systems, would you say it's the amount of shade, or would you say it's the variability in shade, and that not only just for heat but then also for chill events?
Do you want to start with that, Ange? Okay.
I can do if you like. So my commentary back is that I guess we don't know what that meter squared per head allocation should be, or what the sweet spot is. And even from like the feedlot industry, for example, where we know the value and the positive outcomes of providing those animals with shade, we still haven't identified that critical threshold or that minimum threshold. I think, if memory serves me, and please don't hold me to the numbers today, but I think that out in the literature, you can see data from 1 meter squared per animal out to 27 meters squared per animal. So you can see that even in the literature, it's very diverse in terms of what we know exists, and research outcomes from across the world can be quite variable based on those as well. So it's really hard to put a number, and I suspect that different classes of animals have different sweet spots for that allocation as well. And a cow-calf unit would want a slightly bigger allocation again. So it's, yeah, I think it's a complicated one to answer.
Some work out of, I think it's Brazil, but it could be Argentina, but South America. And this is in rangeland environments where they're saying somewhere between 4.5 and about 8 square meters. So yeah, I mean and some of the dairy work that's saying up for dairy cows out to 10 square meters in grazing situations. So it's probably somewhere in that range, but as Ange said, we don't really know where that sweet spot is just at the moment.
And the added complexity about that, of course, is how many water points and how many distribution points of the shade and how many cattle are in there. It's
And all shade's not equal.
so
Yeah.
when you actually do this at a paddock level or at an intervention point, it comes down to a case by case situation, I think, really. Yeah.
And again, one of the key things is still airflow around there as well. And again, some of that work that's come out of South America, they actually saw an increase in heat load on cattle with shade because they had too many trees, and it was actually stopping the airflow coming through. So airflow is still an important consideration, whether it's natural shade or an artificial shade.
And that brings a really nice point too, John. Not all shade is good shade. And how you manage shade is important too, because if you get that congregation under shade and that, like we talked about, like if a water point, for example, you can actually reverse the positive impact by having increased humidity underneath those shade structures, which can actually make it a little bit more challenging. So there is some nuances and some challenges around giving good shade to animals.
That's you make a very good point there, Angela. I know as a climate mate, it's something that when we start to touch on this subject in any workshops, and that it's people say, well, what if I was to put up a shade sail or a shade, erection over our yards and that, and it's how high does it have to be? It's you really do have to start thinking about those sorts of factors when you're looking at spending any money, because you could be throwing good money after bad. It leads me into then looking at, so we're going to flow into now genetics and that breeding for resilience, and we touched on this in the last webinar, and we've received some really good further questions on that. So one of the questions we received is, what do we know about genetics or genomic factors that contribute to resilience against heat stress? And I'm just going to add on to that a little bit as well. And Steph, I'm sure you could also contribute to this, is what about also to that nutritional fetal programming as well going forward in genetics?
Yeah, from the nutrition standpoint, there is a lot of work that is occurring in terms of, as I highlighted, in sheep and lambs, fetal programming, particularly in that last trimester. So supporting that dam to be able to nutritionally provide that fetus with what's required. In terms of specific strategies during gestation, it's still an emerging area, but particularly for early life management or further down the line, there is a number of strategies that can occur. But in terms of genetics, I'll have to pass that on to another panelist to maybe answer.
Oh, look, I can probably pick it up if you like. So in terms of that fetal programming too, there's a lot of work sort of been done in the 90s really around maternal nutrition and impacts on the developing fetus, but that's come from more of a production and carcass quality style perspective rather than heat sort of perspective. And so that dynamic is changing a little bit. We're seeing that nice data come out of the dairy and the pig systems around those epigenetic changes that I spoke to about last week. So it is still that sort of emerging space, and we're still figuring that out a little bit. And just this around this genetic and genomic factors. So my husband actually threw this question out here, so I'll be picking that up with him later. But realistically, there are a lot of genetic and genomic factors out there that are playing in towards this heat resilient sort of animal. But when we have a look at them across the literature and have a look at what's happening at individual scales, there's so much variability in the responses that we can't hand on heart go, there's these 5 genes that are a major driver towards this resilient animal. And that creates some challenges from what we're trying to achieve in our production systems. And I would probably challenge this a little bit too, and this is something that John and I have quite a regular conversation about, is that I think we need to be a little bit careful about talking about a heat resilient animal and just talking about resilient animals in general, because the challenges that they experience aren't just about heat, it's about those nutritional and locomotion stresses as well. So it has to be a little bit more holistic than a sole focus on heat. And I see that Kieran's popped his hand up, so I'm going to throw to him when he's ready. We've lost you, Kieran. Your sound's bounced somewhere else.
Is that
There we
better?
go.
Yeah,
That's good.
I was going to take a step back and just say, well, we're assuming that there is a genetic association here with heat resilience. But if we look, we don't actually have that proven for the beef cattle industry, but we do have lots of other research for other species like dairy and pigs and chickens and things, that there is a growing evidence that this is got some heritability that we could potentially select for moving forward.
You're on mute, Vicky.
Oh, I am too. You need a new host here. And John, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Oh no, I agree with what Ange and Kieran have said. I guess the only other thing is, when we do talk about resilience, what do we mean by that? Because it's going to vary depending on where we are and what other environmental factors those animals are exposed to. So resilience in Northern Victoria is going to be very different to resilience in Northern Queensland in terms of the genetic makeup of the animals. But yeah, it's a hard one. I don't think there's no simple answer to a lot of these sort of things, just because of that variation, the environmental variation and the animal variation, and how do you select for something that hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, that's a good point, John. And you've got your hand raised there.
Yeah, just to add to John's point too about, that the southern environment and heat as well. So I think that we need to be careful about saying that there's no heat challenges in southern environments. I suspect that there are heat challenges in southern environments, and we certainly know that they exist. I suspect that a part of it is that the threshold is lower. So that exposure and experience is happening in those animals at different thresholds in those regions. So we need to be careful about dubbing the heat problems as being a northern problem. It's a countrywide problem, and we just need to think about the thresholds that are relevant for our different regions.
You raise a very, very good point there, Angela. Yeah, and it really doesn't matter which part of Australia you're in at varying times of the year, and depending on how those climate drivers actually impact upon your region as well, can really can drive up those accumulated events. And that actually leads really nicely into this next question. And Tim, we'll bring you in on this one. It's we talk about, like managing for heat and that sort of thing. So we really do know, John, you've mentioned, and Ange, you've mentioned throughout the series there that, like managing for that radiant heat as well. So having that really good vegetation coverage, having that stocking rate right, and having those animals, especially with those neonatals and younger animals that are more susceptible to the radiant heat, in those paddocks that have got those better coverage. But, looking ahead in seasons and that, how can producers use heat stress forecasts to actually reduce the risk? And how do these forecasts compare with commercial services like Kate Stone? And I'll just throw in there on that one, Tim, it's not just about that heat too, it's about that likely chance as well as also getting that rainfall to be able to keep that vegetation coverage on the ground and to be able to manage for those conditions as well.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So as I showed in the first webinar, we currently have heat load and cattle comfort forecasts that go out for 7 to 10 days. So I know it's not a lot of time, particularly if you've got cattle in large areas. But if you do have cattle in feedlots, or you've got a number of feedlots in a particular region, then you can use those forecasts, which are updated every day. Actually, at the moment, they're updated twice a day to get a firmer picture of what's likely in store. And you can complement that with, particularly in the warmer months, the forecasts of heat waves from the Bureau of Meteorology, and also use like the Met Eye surface through the Bureau to get an idea of whether there's rainfall on the horizon. Because we know that particularly after rainfall events, if the conditions are quite calm and the relative humidity stays high and the wind drops, then that can lead to heat stress in cattle who are, mainly due to that those lack of winds and high relative humidity. In terms of how the forecasts compare with commercial services, so we're currently doing some verification work on the forecasts that we currently use, which are the Bureau's deterministic numerical weather prediction model. So I guess watch this space. But what I'd say is that what we offer is a more sort of a spatial you get a better idea of what's happening in your region as opposed to a particular grid point location. So I think for those people who are more visual, I think our forecasts are pretty good.
I am off mute. Sorry. Yeah, I do agree that I think our forecasts are pretty good there. I'm just also just putting into the chat there for anyone that's coming along, as far as looking at those chances of accumulated heat load and sort of what conditions may be looking at in that 7-day forecast. It does. I'm right there, Tim. It does take into consideration some of that additional cloud coverage as our NACP products there that you have. If there's that rainfall events that are on the horizon, it's a good visual tool as some of those forecast maps that we have. And you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, just to add to that. So I think the important thing to remember with that is that all of these forecasting services are a tool available to you, and the tool is a guide and it's a part of a raft of things that you've got available to you to make decisions. And it doesn't matter whether we talk about the bomb service or Kate Stone, they run in slightly different functions. So I don't want to get bogged down in that too much. But the whole point of them is to have a tool that you can help to make informed decisions on. So, if we're a feedlot and we've got this heat event coming through, we can make management decisions to support animals through that particular challenge. And the same can be said around production systems too, or grazing systems rather. So, if we've got a cold, wet event coming through, like we look like we're sitting on at the moment because we're all whining about the cold, you've got capacity potentially to put some additional resources out for your animals to help through this period of time. And at the end of the day, that's the whole point of all of these models, is to give you another tool in your toolbox to help you support your enterprise.
And I'll ask you then that question, Ange, like if we've got producers are looking at, say, Met Eye or, whatever tool it is that they're using to look at a forecast ahead, they've got choppers booked, they've got them locked and loaded they can see that there's a heat event coming up, but, they've already got contractors, whatever, on their places. They're going to keep pushing ahead. What then can producers do? When they're going to keep going ahead with that mustering, because we talk about that locomotion with our livestock, and it is increasing that body heat, that sort of thing. So what is some good simple strategies then? And even Steph, I might even throw to you over to that lung health as a bit of a strategy there as well.
Look, I think that if you can't avoid movement through those hot periods in time, you probably just need to make sure you take it steady. Because that change in body temperature is the thing that starts to take away from other systems. And I think that allowing a slower pace, water resources, and all of that kind of stuff will help if you have no choice. And I would probably defer to John and Kieran who are a bit more of the practical side of things.
I would probably add in there that shade in the yards is probably quite useful in those sort of conditions if that's a possibility. If you've got to move animals during the day when it's hot, you've just got to do it. I mean, you can't send the choppers back because they mightn't be available then for quite a period of time. So anything you can do from a management perspective to reduce that heat load on the animals once they get into yards, if that's where you're taking them to. So shade, I think we talked about reducing dust last time. So anything we can do to reduce dust load in those yards would be beneficial. And as Anne said, just move them as slow as possible, but be aware that you're going to have animals that are going to be hot. And so again, adequate water supply, good quality water is going to become important. Kieran?
Yeah, just the thing I would add is that any surgical procedures or things like that where elevated heart rate or blood flow is going to compromise the outcome is probably things that you need to consider. So if there's any, over-ectomizing, spaying, those types of husbandry procedures, if you can modify that slightly, or do it early morning or the timing or probably afternoon, cooler times, things like that are going to help the outcome, I think. We're all a lot of these things that we're talking about here aren't demonstrated in the literature that we can sort of say, it's going to reduce mortality by this amount and things like that. But it makes a lot of sense, and we have a lot of sort of contextual information saying that these things are likely to be playing a role, and would improve the chances of good outcome if you were to make these small changes.
You're muted again, Vicky.
Someone keeps muting me. Steph, John mentioned there about that dust and that, and just how important is it if we're going to be moving stock and that is having those that dust suppressed in those yards?
If possible, yes. If you can set up some sprinklers in the yards, particularly with your weaners, of course, dust, flies, stress is all going to contribute to increased risk in pneumonia. And just to add on the water quality, get a water quality test because a lot of times around weaning, particularly, pneumonia is very contagious. So one of the questions I did see after that webinar was what can be done. Essentially, if you see sick calves, separate them from the rest of the mob so they're not sharing a feed trough, water trough, and pretty much I've seen waters that are really high in sodium and chlorides that can cause a lot of scouring in particularly calves, which can exacerbate dehydration and, of course, then heat stress. So there's a a lot of different feed additives you can put into feed, but get the basics right, and particularly around fill their guts with a good quality roughage, so a hay in particular paired with a suitable supplement.
I like how you said there, Steph, about getting those basics right. And one of the things that, I know as a climate mate for a region there of Central West Queensland, I'm wondering when we're helping work with producers and that, we know that we've had this shift over as an industry, we're really looking to manage for nutritional stress and that sort of thing going forward. Now, this is in our pregnant and early lactating animals and that, and is aligning with Green Date. And we know we're still doing the research on this. For those, how can I word this? There's been some really great research and that has been done, and some great work that's been done, like in the Leading Sheep program, and that's worked very well in the southern half of Australia. We've got this shift now of moving over to autumn lambings and moving ahead when we've got that nutrition in front of us and having those twins on the ground and managing for that. We've also then encouraging producers to scan and to be moving and doing more intensive management decisions around that nutrition. given that the time of year and the type of heat load events that we're having, typically, you know, when that scanning's happening around that January, February period, do you think then, nutritionally wise, Steph, that there is that necessity then to, are we undoing the good by actually scanning in that January, February and putting those animals under stress, trying to find out if they're going to have twins to nutritionally manage them then in the autumn?
That's a big question. There's a lot of components to that one. Look, if it's unavoidable based on your management systems that you've got to do these scans, management practices at certain times of the year, you just got to be smart about it. There's no silver bullet you can put in the feed to help reduce stress, but nutrition can really bolster the immune responses of those animals to help them overcome that muster. It's complicated. There's nothing I can say with certain. Maybe others can share what. So,
John, I'll throw to you on that with your thoughts about, you know, like with some of these production systems that we're seeing, and some of the recommendations about, you know, really managing for lamb and calf survivability, and, you know, looking at having our animals on that really good nutritional feed going forward, but in setting animals up for that period of time, though, we're inadvertently then having to set them up to do other management decisions prior to that at times of the year that aren't really conducive for it. What would your recommendations be going forward on that?
I'll pass over to Kieran.
Um,
I think Kieran can probably answer that a bit better than I can.
Generally, I just think that, you know, procedures to help us manage the greater good of the mob. I know this is a bit of an awkward way to answer this, but I think, you know, pregnancy testing, scanning, where you can make a decision to ultimately look after the mob better, when it's performed well, there's a lot more benefits from doing that than in the situation that it might result in a few, like, you know, perhaps a few losses, and we know that they would be relatively minor. When it comes to sort of fetal death and things like that, I mean, obviously, if you're doing these procedures soon after conception, that's more of a risk period than if you get into the second trimester type time frame. So once you get into that second, third trimester, you know, they're relatively robust at that stage.
But I think, I mean, just follow on from that and what Steph had said, you know, nutrition plays a major role in this. And yes, we can get away from heat by changing breeding seasons, but then do we have the nutrition to do what we need to do with the cows or the ewes in terms of milk production and pregnancy and so on? So it's always going to be a bit of a trade-off between what we can do nutritionally versus how the environment's going to interact with what we want to do. I think we just have to work with that. And as Kieran said, if there's some losses, there's going to be some losses. But if the overall mob is doing well, then we're probably in front.
And you've got some thoughts there with
Yeah,
that?
I just think this is one of these prime opportunities where if you don't have capacity to change what you're doing in your production system, like we all know that nutrition in the ewe is really important to fetal outcomes and birth growth, all of that stuff. Articulating that very poorly today. But we know that that's really important. So having an appreciation for your triplet, twin, and singleton ewes is important for your production enterprise, right? But if you have no choice but to scan in January or February, maybe it is, can you bring them in smaller mobs so they've got more room in the yards to spread out? Can you put shade up? Or if you can't bring them in smaller mobs, can you open up a paddock adjacent to your yards and let them naturally spread out? So there's these sort of little nuances that maybe it isn't big changes to your enterprise and how you do things, but the little ones that you can do along the way that might help contribute to the greater whole, and it still allows you to nutritionally manage those ewes.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good point, Ange, because how often do we see hundreds of ewes crammed into a yard? No, right, and so there's no airflow, there's no shade.
Yeah.
Yeah. As you talk about, John, that airflow, that's it's sort of paramount to helping them to be able to regulate that temperature better and cope with those situations. Tim, speaking with temperature and that, we did have a question pop up, and I got to admit, I've always wondered this too. What is black globe temperature, and why is it important in assessing livestock heat stress? What is it?
So black globe temperature is simply just measuring the temperature inside a thin copper.
Do you want me to show one? I've got one hanging on my bookcase right there.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
Hang on.
But it's important because it's a way of measuring the impact of solar radiation on temperature. So that's why we need to have black globe temperature when we measure the heat load index, because otherwise we'd have to rely on say the THI or other metrics that don't include solar radiation. So.
Looks like a trough float, and
well, effectively that's what it is. Okay, so it's a 15 centimeter metal, traditionally copper ball, and it has a thermometer that's stuck on the inside. This one's a little bent, so forgive me, this is a teaching one.
The original ones actually came out of the toilet floats, copper toilet floats.
Ah, I never knew that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the thermometer for it sits directly in the center of the copper ball.
There is science behind it.
There is. So it's the copper ball with a temperature sensor inside it. And this is a matte black. So all of our environmental conditions influence what happens to this ball's temperature. And so that's why we like to use it as a metric.
Wow. Okay, I've never seen one. That's fascinating. I know we've gone a little bit over time.
The temperature in the black globe will change. The temperature in the black globe will change with wind and rain and as well as sun. So it's, as Anne said, it brings into account a lot of the environmental factors. So that's that temperature. The air temperature might be 38 degrees, but if you're standing out in the sun, that black globe temperature might be 50. And so that's what you're actually feeling.
Interestingly, I have this one hanging up beside my window, and I have another one hanging up in the back corner of my office as well.
Okay. Managing your accumulated heat load there.
Yeah, correct.
It's good to see. Good to see. Look, I'm just going to throw over to, we've still got some participants left. I know we've gone over time, but I think this is, if you've just got another 5 minutes, is there anybody that is actually joining us in on the webinar there today that does have any questions? Please pop your hand up or pop it into the Q&A. I see that throughout these questions have been getting answered in the chat there, and also through the conversation. We've inadvertently answered to a lot of these questions that are coming over, but does anybody have any questions that hasn't been raised that you just would like to know? Please pop your hand up or unmute yourself if you can. Not seeing anything come through, but I'm just going to throw to finish off while we wait to see if anyone does have any questions. If you could give one important strategy or takeaway, and I'll throw to you first, Steph, because you're the first one showing up on my screen there. What's the one important takeaway strategy for producers after, what we've discussed in this series?
Heat stress management requires a multifactorial approach. So nutrition, genetics, management. It's not going to be a one size fits all. It's going to be unique to your location, your herd, your feed base, essentially. So,
Tim?
Well, I'm just going to be selfish and say use the forecasts that we have through NACP webpage on mechanical thermal stress. And if there's anything that's not there or you don't understand or want changed, please let us know, because that's the one thing, the benefit of having NACP is that we take all feedback, good or bad or difficult, as opposed to, say, the Bureau, which is a much harder beast to to see change in. So yeah, give us feedback, and we're happy to try and satisfy everyone.
Rachel?
I would actually echo Tim there. Use all the tools you have available, including those forecasts. And yeah, we love feedback. We love improving our services to better serve you. So reach out to us if you need anything.
And Kieran?
Thanks, Vicky. A couple of things that we haven't mentioned today that I think probably should be considered with this as well. But generally, I think that, even though we talk about these issues in isolation, and echoing what Steph said, it is a complex system that we have to think about the whole enterprise at a profitability level, even at the end of the day, and a sustainability level. Some of the things that I don't think we have touched on is past utilization or stocking rates. I think if you've got good ground cover and there's plenty of forage, and like we talk about trees and things, but I think that pasture cover and it will impact on reflectance or radiation heat. So if you do have that sort of to keep that in mind with your stocking rates, obviously your animal condition and things like that is going to be better as well. So they'll be able to accommodate it a bit more. The other thing is that we are still learning about this ourselves, I think, and I think we talk about some of these effects that are sometimes based on acute responses, but if we're talking about pregnancy and things like that, that's over a 9-month period, so does that increase our risk, or do we need really persistent, high, long, chronic sort of heat load events for it to actually have a production impact? And I think that's where we're trying to tease out and trying to define what is a good phenotype for an animal, whether or not it is good to have an animal grazing out there and just toughen it out in the hot. Is that a good thing? Or maybe the one running to the shade is a more productive animal.
Yeah, you raise a very good point there, Kieran. I actually wondered after our last, webinar, some of those animals that, we do see come in empty, have they just been really, really efficient at actually getting rid of a pregnancy and coping and getting themselves to survive than, those that have come in and have had a pregnancy, but yeah, it makes you really sit back and think a little bit, and there certainly needs to be a lot more to be done. Angela?
Look, my things probably are, don't be frightened to try something new, even if it is small. We do spend a lot of time searching for the silver bullet, and unfortunately, as Steph really nicely covered as well, is that managing heat is not a simple solution, and so it is a number of little things that create a greater change. And so just don't be frightened to try something small and start with baby steps.
Great advice there, Ange. Great advice. And John, I'll throw to you last. As somebody who's inspired this series, and it inspired me as a producer, and as you said, Ange, trying just those little things. I know personally at home we tried with some heifers, just shifting over our period of timing of year, and we've certainly seen some benefits, but I do understand that's not for everyone. And John, we know that you're retiring out of this space, so I think it's only fitting that we leave the last word to yourself.
Thanks, Vicky. Well, yeah, I mean, I'd echo what everyone said so far. I think, it is a complex area. I think we do probably focus too much on the acute events, like Kieran mentioned. And the acute events are important, but they're the ones that are probably the hardest to manage. So really, I think our focus should be more on what's happening over the full 12-month period. So the chronic events are the ones that are driving what we see. So if the average daytime and nighttime temperature are going up, it may not be an acute event, but it could still be having an impact on production. So keeping an eye on those nighttime temperatures, particularly over the summer months, the chronic effects rather than the acute. I'm not saying the acute's not important, it is, but if a heat wave's coming in 5 days, it's pretty hard to do something. But if we know we're going to have 5 months of conditions where it's going to be hot, then some of those things, like Anne said, just doing small incremental things over time to see what works, what doesn't work. Every property is going to be different. Paddocks are different. So there's just so much complexity in the system. And again, as Kieran said, we're still learning a lot in this space. And, I remember when I started doing this work years ago, I was told, there's no need to do any heat stress work because we know everything. And that was 30 odd years ago, and we don't know everything, and we're still learning every day. So yeah, it's a long process.
Yeah, it seems to be, John. And on behalf of, I know, all our industry, we've got to thank you and the team, all of you here today, presenters, for the work that you're doing in this space and being able to help producers, not only like myself, but all of producers across Northern Australia to actually better manage it for our seasonal conditions ahead and those longer term conditions, and be able to keep that productivity in our herd. I've not seen any other questions come through. I think we've pretty much covered it. So that brings an end today to this session and a close to our livestock thermal stress series. Over these webinars, we've had a chance to step back and really take a deep dive into a very complex subject of accumulated heat load, but we've also talked about those chill and exposure events as well, as we did back in webinar 1. So that importance of monitoring for those minimum temperatures, humidity, airflow. John, I've just talked about that. Airflow is very important, and stopping that locomotion if we can in our livestock. That's a good start. I can't help but think back to the good old spear trap days when we used to use spear traps to block animals up, and maybe we might start seeing a few more people bringing back the spear traps or setting up portable yards to start lessening that locomotion and movement in our livestock. So a big thank you to all our presenters, and a big thank you to the funders of the Northern Australian Climate Project, which is the Drought and Climate Adaptation Program, Meat and Livestock Australia, and the University of Southern Queensland. Thank you to the team at the University of Queensland, Gatton campus, and to also the Southern Queensland, Northern New South Wales Innovation Hub. We've had Ali in the background there doing a terrific job of monitoring the chat and helping us keeping things flowing. So please take the time to do the survey, and will pop up. This will really help us drive forward. We've had inquiries about field days and workshops, and it's something we do take seriously and would really love to deliver that going forward. So on behalf of everyone, I thank you very much for your time, and next Tuesday, it'll be finding something new to do on a Tuesday lunch hour. So thank you very much, everyone.
I'd just like to thank Vicky for everything she did to organise this seminar series over the last few weeks. If it wasn't for her, it wouldn't have happened. So thank you very much, Vicky, for getting this done. Been a great effort.
Thank you, John. Thank you. But no, it's you guys that have inspired this and the work that you're doing, and what we still don't know. And I think in the back of our minds as producers, we do know, but it's just being now more consciously aware of those decisions we're making. So thank you, team. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.